Have you ever been judged your whole life? Simply because you were too quiet? Not because you were wrong, not because you were useless, but simply because you didn't speak up loud enough in a world that always favors those who are more vocal. Clara Whitfield was such a woman. In the late 19th century, in the town of Willow Creek, Vermont, she lived a quiet life in the town's small library, devoted, proper, without complaint. But when she decided to become a mail-order bride, her only hope for a family and a place in life, she was rejected. Reason: too shy, not charismatic enough. It's not because she doesn't know how to work. It's not because she lacks virtue. It's because she doesn't know how to get people's attention. So what if it were you? If you lived your whole life being decent and hardworking, but when it came time to choose, you were rejected simply because you didn't fit society's expectations. Would you stay and accept it, or dare to embark on a completely different path? Clara chose to leave. Not to find romantic love, but to find a place where she was needed. And then in the harsh frontier of Montana, where nobody cares what you say or where you go, only how you live, a gruff, taciturn man saw something in her that the world had overlooked. Stay with us and listen to the story of a woman rejected for being too kind, and how her true value was recognized, not through words, but through her life. If you love slow-paced, profound, and human stories like this, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join us on Clara Whitfield's journey. Mornings in Millbrook always begin with the church bells and end with the wind rustling through the old cobblestone streets. Between these two sounds, the town lives on a regular, familiar rhythm, unhurried and waiting for no one. And in a place where everyone believes everything has long been in place, Eleanor Whitfield appears each day as part of that order, quiet, punctual, unobtrusive. She works in the town library. It wasn't the grand library with towering bookshelves or warm yellow lighting. Millbrook Library was just a low brick building with a gray-tiled roof nestled behind the town hall. But Eleanor cared for it with the dedication of someone who understood that order wasn't just about putting books in their proper place, but about keeping this little world from descending into chaos. Every morning she opens the front door before the sun rises high. She dusts the windowsill. She rearranges misplaced books. She glues together worn book spines. She does these things slowly, precisely, as if each movement had been practiced long ago, not to be seen, but so as not to disturb anyone. People were used to Eleanor being there. I've become so used to her that I don't even see her anymore. They walked past the librarian's desk, placed their books down, exchanged a polite nod, and left. They asked to borrow books, inquired about closing times, asked about the weather, but rarely did they ask how she was. In the minds of the Millbrook community, Eleanor Whitfield was part of the property, necessary but unremarkable. In Millbrook, it's believed that whoever speaks louder is right. Men debated in the pub near the train station. Housewives chatted animatedly after Sunday services. Local politicians stood in the square, raising their hands and making promises. The air was filled with sound, and in that noise Eleanor's silence became invisible. She wasn't shy in the weak sense. She just wasn't used to butting in. Not used to raising her voice. Not used to making her presence a statement. She believed that if she did her job well enough, if she kept things in place, the world would recognize her value on its own. But the world rarely does that. Eleanor lived with her mother in a small wooden house on the edge of town. Her mother was frail and had been ill for many years. Every evening after closing the library, Eleanor would go home, cook soup, read the newspaper to her mother, and mend old clothes. Her life unfolded in small, repetitive tasks, with no moment significant enough to be called a major event. And that's why no one thought to ask what would happen to her if those little things suddenly disappeared. When her mother died one autumn afternoon, Millbrook sent flowers and condolences, then quickly returned to his normal routine. Eleanor returned to the library after 3 days of leave earlier than scheduled because she didn't know where else she could be. No one asked why. No one noticed that her silence was now heavier than before. In town meetings, people began talking about a new image, a new vitality, necessary modernity. They spoke in big words with firm voices, and when Eleanor Whitfield's name was mentioned, it was accompanied neither by praise nor criticism, only by a vague hesitation. She does a good job. Everyone knows that. But in a changing world, good is sometimes not enough. Eleanor didn't hear the conversations immediately. She only sensed a change in gaze. The nods became shorter. The greetings became less frequent. She stood in the middle of the room full of books, and for the first time in her life she felt as if she were taking someone else's place. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the library window, Eleanor paused longer than usual before an old book. She gently stroked the cover, a comforting habit. She didn't cry. Not yet. But in her heart a question began to form slowly, persistently, like a small crack in the ice. If a person lives their entire life upright and dedicated but is never noticed by anyone, does that person truly exist? That question didn't have an immediate answer. It just sat there quietly waiting, just like Eleanor Whitfield herself. And it was in that stillness, when everything remained intact on the surface, that the first unexpected changes began to shift beneath her feet. Because there are moments when life doesn't collapse with a loud noise, but with a decision made in silence in another room by people who never learned to listen. After her mother's funeral, Clara Bennett returned to the Ashford Library on a cold gray morning. The town was the same. The familiar streets, the familiar faces. No one asked if she had slept well. No one mentioned the house where she now lived alone. In Ashford, they believed that grief was a private matter, and private matters should not be brought into the public eye. Clara understood that. She always understood. She opened the library door as she had done for the past 15 years. She wiped the tables, checked the borrowing register, rearranged the books that had been knocked over. Everything went so smoothly that from the outside one might think nothing had changed. But inside Clara, a pillar had just fallen, and she was learning to stand tall without leaning on it. The first few weeks passed quietly, too quietly. One afternoon, Clara received a message from the town secretary. A meeting. No reason given. Just that it was related to the library. She carefully folded the piece of paper, put it in her coat pocket, and continued working until the end of the day, a habit not easily broken. The Ashford Town Council meeting room was small, with a low ceiling, and hung with portraits of the men who had led the town. Clara sat in the last chair, her back straight, her hands resting on her lap. She wasn't used to speaking in rooms like this, but she believed she didn't need to say much. Her work spoke for itself. She was mistaken. They talked about a new era, about development, about the need for libraries to become more dynamic community centers. The words drifted through the air like smoke, beautiful, vague, elusive. Clara listened, trying to find her place within those words. Then one of the council members, a younger man with a clear voice, gently raised the issue. "We have no doubt about Miss Bennett's abilities," he said, glancing at Clara with a polite smile. "But these days demand more than quiet dedication." No one objected. No one nodded. But the room seemed to have reached a consensus. Another person continued, speaking slowly as if explaining something obvious. "The library needs a representative, someone who can connect, who can inspire, not just someone who does a good job." The words fell onto the table like a cold object. Clara didn't immediately grasp its full meaning. She just felt a strange sense of familiarity, a feeling she'd experienced many times in her life but never quite put a name to. A feeling that whatever she did, however right, wasn't enough because she didn't know how to get people's attention. They didn't say she did a poor job. They didn't criticize her mistakes. They just said she lacked something. Lack of social appeal. Lack of representation. Lack of a voice. Clara sat still. Not because she agreed, but because she didn't know how to refute it. How could she prove the value of silence in a room filled only with loud voices? The meeting ended with handshakes and polite thank yous. Clara was the last to stand. No one tried to stop her. No one said whether a decision had been made or not. But she understood. She always understood the unspoken truths. That evening, Clara returned home in the flickering light of an oil lamp. The small kitchen echoed with the ticking of an old clock, the only sound breaking the silence. She sat down at the table, placing her hands on the worn wooden surface. Those hands had once arranged thousands of books, kept order to countless other people's stories. But Clara had never arranged her own story. She thought about the years gone by, about taking care of her mother, about late nights at the library, about times she let others speak because she believed it was the right thing to do. She had never thought that her silence would be seen as a flaw. In Ashford, they don't call it injustice. They call it fitting the times. And the most painful thing wasn't the possibility of losing her job. It was realizing that her whole life she had lived by values that society once cherished: hard work, humility, dedication. But now those very values were making her outdated. Clara didn't cry. Not at that moment. She simply sat still, listening to her own breathing, and for the first time allowed a dangerous thought to creep into her mind. If this place no longer needed her, where else did she belong? That question went unanswered that night, but it opened a door, a small, narrow one leading to paths Clara Bennett never thought she would walk, because when silence is labeled a flaw, people are forced to learn to find their value elsewhere, further, harsher, but also more authentic. And when Clara Bennett left the meeting room that day, she had no idea that beyond the familiar paths of Ashford, there were escapes that no one advised against, yet were the only places where there was still room for the dignity of a silent person. After that day's council meeting, Ruth Callahan returned to her small house on the edge of Green Hollow as darkness fell. The oil lamp in the kitchen burned dimly, casting her shadow on the old yellowed wall. The house was so silent that Ruth could hear the wood creaking in the cold, a familiar sound, but tonight it sounded longer than usual. She hung her coat on the hook, took off her gloves, and neatly arranged them as usual. Ruth maintained her old habits even though there was no one here to remind her. Her parents had long since passed away. Her distant relatives had their own families. Green Hollow knew her, but no one really thought about where she would go if one day she was no longer behind the library counter. Ruth sat down at the dining table, which had once comfortably seated 4 people. Now only one chair was pulled out each evening. She poured hot water, dropped a tea bag into a cup, and waited for the water to darken. These small things helped her delay what was rising in her mind, an awareness that was not easy to accept. She had nothing left to rely on. No family, no possessions, no voice in a community that had become accustomed to taking her silence for granted. Green Hollow never outright dismissed Ruth, but they were gradually paving the way for someone else, someone more suitable. Someone who could speak, someone who could make an appearance, someone who could make their existence useful in the eyes of the masses. Ruth understood. She always understood the unwritten rules very well. That evening, while tidying up her father's old papers, Ruth found a stack of newspapers tied together with string. The newspapers were yellowed and smelled faintly of old paper. She wasn't usually one to read newspapers in the evening, but her hand stopped at a page in the classified section where people posted small, often overlooked pieces of information. Reputable women skilled in housework seeking a stable life in the Mekong Delta. Please contact us at the address below. Ruth read slowly. Then she read it again. There were no romantic promises, no mention of love, no talk of happiness, just dry, practical words, like an agreement between 2 people who had never met. A marriage of letters. Ruth put the newspaper down. She didn't feel her heart racing. There was no excitement, the kind people usually talk about when thinking about marriage. Instead, there was a different feeling, a deeper, heavier one, like standing at a crossroads with no signposts. She had heard of women leaving the East for distant lands. Some succeeded. Some failed. Some vanished from the town's memory, as if they had never existed. That wasn't Ruth's dream. She didn't dream about a stranger. She didn't dream about love. She only dreamed, if you could call it that, about being needed. At Green Hollow, Ruth did everything right. She studied. She cared for her family. She worked diligently. But all of that wasn't enough to keep her there. Not enough to guarantee that she would still have a place tomorrow. In Ruth's imagination, the West was not a place of freedom or romance. It was harsh, remote, and full of uncertainty. But it had something that Green Hollow no longer offered her need. In developing lands, people need hands. They need patience. They need people who know how to work without needing applause or praise. Ruth carefully folded the newspaper. She didn't make a decision right away. She left it on the table beside her now cold cup of tea. That night she lay listening to the wind whistling through the cracks in the door, thinking about the railroads stretching westward, about the new towns springing up in the wilderness. She thought about her age, no longer young enough to start over easily, but not old enough to accept disappearing silently either. The next morning, Ruth arrived at the library earlier than usual. She looked around the familiar room, the bookshelves, the wooden tables, the light streaming through the tall windows. Every little corner bore the mark of her touch. But for the first time she saw the place as a guest, not a caretaker. She understood that if she stayed, she would have to learn to survive in an increasingly smaller role. Fewer hours, less voice, less value, at least in the eyes of others. The West didn't promise anything, but it didn't force her to shrink herself to fit into old molds. In the afternoon, Ruth returned home and took out paper and pen. She wrote slowly, her handwriting neat and unadorned. She didn't talk about her loneliness. She didn't complain. She only spoke of her abilities, of her hard work, of her endurance, of her frugality and her promise. It wasn't a love letter. It was a request to exist in a useful way. As Ruth Callahan closed the letter, she knew she had just chosen a path no one in Green Hollow would have advised her to take. But in that very moment she felt something strange, a sense of relief, not because the future had become clear, but because for the first time in years this decision was her own. Because sometimes people don't leave because they want more, but because they can no longer live in a place where there is no longer room for their quiet dignity. And when the letter left Green Hollow on the early train the next morning, Ruth Callahan had no idea that in a land far more distant than she could have imagined, a man would know her only through her handwriting, and a new life would begin from those perfectly written words. The first letter arrived one misty morning just as Lydia Monroe had finished lighting the stove. The stamp was worn, the postmark faded, as if it had passed through more hands than necessary before reaching her. Lydia held the envelope for a long time, not opening it immediately. She was used to waiting for the water to boil, waiting for the bread to bake, waiting for things that were uncertain to happen. The handwriting on the envelope was neat and tidy. It wasn't elaborate or rushed. It was the handwriting of someone who knew what they wanted to say and didn't need to say more. Samuel Crowley. The name evokes nothing specific, not imaginative, not poetic. But Lydia wasn't seeking poetry. She was seeking something else: stability written in carefully considered words. The letter inside wasn't long. Samuel writes about Pine Creek, a small developing town near a newly opened railroad. He speaks of cattle ranching, of the harsh but predictable climate. He doesn't talk about emotions. He doesn't mention loneliness. He doesn't use grand words. Just simple, straightforward sentences, as if he were filling out a report. I don't promise wealth. I only promise to work hard and keep my word. Lydia read that sentence twice. In her generation, people were taught that handwriting reflected character. Those who wrote carelessly lived carelessly. Those who wrote evasively were evasive. Samuel Crowley wrote like someone who had no need to impress. And that's what Lydia believed. She sat down at the table, placing the letter by the window. The morning light shone on the page, revealing the ink that had faded from the long journey. Lydia thought about the letter she had sent, short, proper, without a single superfluous word. Two strangers meeting at the intersection of need and kindness. The subsequent letters arrived regularly, exactly 3 weeks apart. Not too soon. Not too late. Samuel wrote about the coming winter, about the need for another person to manage the household. He asked Lydia if she could tolerate the dry, cold climate, if she was used to living away from a large community. None of the questions were about love. Lydia found it strangely pleasant. She answered each question in the same tone. She said she was used to living frugally, used to working without supervision. She didn't embellish herself. There was no need to. She just needed to be understood. Every time Lydia received a letter, she read it slowly. Not because the handwriting was difficult to read, but because she wanted to feel the rhythm of the writer. Some people write quickly, their words running before their thoughts. Samuel was not like that. His handwriting stood firm on the paper, as if each stroke had been carefully considered. On long evenings, as the wind blew through the cracks in the door, Lydia would place the letters on the table, neatly arranged. She didn't dream of Samuel's face. She didn't imagine what his voice sounded like. She only knew that far away a man was building his life on the same principles she had lived her whole life, doing the right thing at the right time and never promising what she couldn't keep. In the small town where Lydia lived, some people began to whisper, "Marriage by letters isn't a serious matter. How can you know what they're writing?" Lydia heard but didn't argue. She was used to letting others say what they wanted. She only believed what she read with her own eyes. Samuel didn't write much about himself. But there were small details that caught Lydia's attention: the way he described repairing the fence before winter, the way he mentioned the elderly neighbor who needed help. These things weren't written to evoke emotion. They were simply there. And that's why they carried weight. One afternoon, Lydia received a final letter before she had to make a decision. Samuel wrote that if she agreed, he would send the money for the train ticket. No pressure, no assumptions, just a clearly stated choice. Lydia folded the letter and put it in the drawer. She didn't need more time to dream. She needed time to make sure she was seeing things as they truly were. She thought about her life so far, a series of quiet, uneventful days at work, but also unremarkable. Pine Creek didn't promise happiness, but it did promise a role, a place in other people's lives, a place where her presence would have a concrete meaning. That night, Lydia wrote back. She wrote that she agreed. Nothing more. When the envelope was sealed, Lydia felt a strange calm. Not joy, not fear, just the feeling of someone who had made a decision that was right for them. Because for people of the older generation, writing wasn't about persuasion, it was about commitment. And sometimes that very integrity was the closest thing to the truth. And when Lydia Monroe placed her last letter in the postal bag, she had no idea that some departures begin so properly, so orderly, but lead people to crossroads of no return. Abigail Turner left Maple Crossing one morning while the town was still asleep. The morning mist obscured the wooden rooftops, and the dirt road leading to the train station was so silent that the wheels of her suitcase creaked slowly. No one was there to see her off. Not a single hand waved. And Abigail didn't look back. She didn't want to see that town again, not out of resentment, but because she was afraid she would soften her heart. Maple Crossing raised her, gave her a job, and provided her with just enough space to survive. But it never gave her a sense of belonging. Abigail had understood this long ago, only recently daring to name it. The night before she left, she tidied up the small room where she had lived for more than 10 years. There wasn't much in it. An old wooden trunk, a few simple dresses, a worn Bible, and letters neatly bound with faded silver ribbon. Abigail folded each item carefully, as if that tidiness could keep her from panicking. No one threw a farewell party for her. No one asked when she was coming back. And that silence, prolonged and consistent, was the clearest confirmation that her decision to leave was the right one. That morning, when Abigail locked the door of her room for the last time, the landlady was still asleep. She was kind, but kind in the Maple Crossing way, uncomplicated, not intrusive. Abigail left the key on the kitchen counter next to a note that simply said, "Thank you." She stepped outside, carrying the baggage of a lifetime of simple living. Not heavy in material possessions, heavy in memories. The small train station was on the edge of town. The tracks stretched towards the horizon, disappearing behind a grove of bare trees. Abigail stood waiting for the early train, her hands clasped together to keep warm. She didn't know what she was hoping for, a sign, a greeting, but nothing happened. And it's not necessary anyway. Abigail Turner was used to going unnoticed. She used to think that if she lived honestly and humbly enough, the world would naturally open its eyes to her. But Maple Crossing taught her a different lesson. Silence, if prolonged, can be misinterpreted as meaningless. She didn't leave out of anger. She left because she no longer wanted to shrink herself any further. When the train arrived, its whistle shattered the stillness. Abigail boarded the third-class carriage, choosing a seat near the window. She placed her trunk under the seat, sat up straight, and rested her hands on her lap, a familiar posture of a woman who had spent her life trying not to take up too much space. The train began to move. Maple Crossing receded behind slowly, without drama. The rooftops, the streets, the churches all passed by like pages already read. Abigail watched without tears. There are farewells that don't need tears to prove what's lost. She thought about what she was leaving behind: an uncertain job, a community that no longer needed her, a role that was becoming increasingly insignificant. But intertwined with these thoughts was another feeling, lighter yet distinct. She has preserved her dignity. Don't stay to be pitied. Don't stay to be silently replaced. Don't stay to become a shadow of yourself. Abigail didn't know what lay ahead. She only knew that in the place she was going to, no one knew who she was. And that, for a woman who had been bound by old definitions, was a rare opportunity. The train sped across vast fields, past small towns where strangers boarded and alighted. Abigail watched them, listening to their fragmented conversations. Each person had their own reason for leaving or staying. No one explained. No one needed to. She thought about the letter that had prompted her to board this train, a letter written in a calm tone, promising nothing but stability. To others, it might have been a reckless choice. To Abigail, it was a calculated step taken at a moment when staying meant losing what mattered most: honor. Some people leave to find happiness. Some people leave to escape. Abigail left so she wouldn't have to ask anyone for permission to exist fully. As the afternoon sun slanted through the train window, illuminating her face, tiny wrinkles became visible, the quiet marks of time. Abigail closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. For the first time in years, she didn't have to prepare for tomorrow in the same old way. No one can promise that the road ahead will be easy, but at least it's the path she chose herself. Because there are departures that go unseen, unremembered, yet it is these in silence that open up another life where people do not need to apologize for their existence. And as the train carrying Abigail Turner departed Maple Crossing, she had no idea that on its long journey through a changing America, those unfamiliar faces and prolonged silences would begin to teach her to see herself in a completely new light. The train left the station before dawn. Eleanor Price sat by the window, her hands resting on a small cloth bag on her lap. The bag contained little, a few folded clothes, a thin notebook, and a pencil short from being sharpened too many times. That was all she had brought with her for the long journey across a changing America. The train carriage was not quiet. It had never been quiet. The sound of metal scraping against the tracks, the dry cough of a man at the back, the whispered broken English of two young immigrants. But amidst all these sounds, Eleanor still felt a very personal silence, the silence of someone observing without participating. She was used to it. Opposite Eleanor sat a widowed woman dressed in black, clutching a worn leather bag. She was a woman of few words. Each time the train stopped, she would look out the window as if searching for something that was no longer there. Further away were the railroad workers, their clothes stained and their shoes covered in dried mud. They spoke loudly, laughed, and argued as if trying to fill the void with their voices. Eleanor didn't judge. She just watched. She took out her notebook, placed it on her knees, and wrote a few short lines, not to record the event but to preserve the feeling. What she saw wasn't the America of speeches or advertising posters. It was the America of people on the move because of loss, because of hope, because they no longer had a place in their old lives. Each train station was a different slice of life. Some were bustling, others just a wooden shelter with a few people waiting. Eleanor saw new towns springing up around the tracks, makeshift shops and unpainted signs. She also saw abandoned fields and houses with empty windows, as if someone had left in a hurry without looking back. America is changing, but not uniformly. In the dining car, Eleanor sat alone. She ate slowly, savoring each bite of cake, each sip of weak coffee. She listened to stories not meant for her, a man talking about his new job in the West, a young couple discussing land prices, a mother worrying about her son who had gone to seek his fortune. These stories intertwined, forming a large picture of which Eleanor was just a small brushstroke. And she's okay with that. On this train, Eleanor didn't have to explain who she was. No one asked what she had done. No one judged her silence. Here, silence was simply a way of existing among people who were also trying to exist in their own way. At night, as the train carriage darkened, Eleanor leaned her head against the window. The darkness outside flowed by like a river without banks. She thought about her life so far, a series of regular days, consistent but also without any new beginnings. This train journey offered nothing different, but it gave her distance, and that distance allowed her to see things more clearly. She realized she had lived too long in cramped spaces where every action was scrutinized, every silence interpreted. On this train among strangers, Eleanor relearned an old lesson: silence isn't always a deficiency. Sometimes it's the only way to listen to the world without distorting it. One morning, the train stopped longer than usual. Eleanor stepped onto the platform, taking a deep breath of the cold air. She saw an elderly man watching the train as if it carried his entire past with it. She saw a little boy running after his mother, clutching an oversized hat. These images weren't dramatic, but they lingered in Eleanor's memory longer than any grand spectacle. She wrote it down not to tell anyone, but to remind herself that the world was larger than the rooms that had once held her captive. The train continued to roll. With each passing mile, a layer of old material was peeled away. Eleanor didn't know who she would become when she arrived. But she knew that the woman sitting in this carriage was different from the woman who had boarded a few days earlier. Not stronger, not more courageous, in a flashy way, just more level-headed. Because when an ordinary woman sees an entire country in motion, she begins to understand that change doesn't always come from big decisions, but from daring to step out of her comfort zone and allowing herself to observe without fear. And as the train slowly pulled into its final station, Eleanor Price had no idea that at that destination no one would be waiting for her name to be called, and that very absence would be the first test of her new life. The train stopped at Dry Creek as the sun was setting in the west. The last rays of sunlight cast a pale yellow hue over the platform, not warm enough to dispel the dry wind blowing across the new land. Hannah Cole stepped off the train, her legs slightly numb from sitting for so long, clutching the canvas bag that had accompanied her throughout the long journey. She stood still for a moment, as if waiting for someone to call her name. There was no call. Dry Creek wasn't a large station. Just a wooden awning, a few hastily stacked crates, and a few men standing around talking amongst themselves. They glanced at Hannah just for a moment, then went back to their business. No one approached her. No one asked her where she was from. Hannah looked around, trying to find a familiar face from the letters she had read. She remembered the neat handwriting, the dignified tone, the promises of stability. But on this platform there were only unfamiliar faces, sun-tanned and weary from the border region. Charles wasn't there. Hannah didn't panic immediately. Not yet. She told herself that he might be late. Maybe the train was earlier than expected. In the West, time often didn't follow written schedules. She pulled the bag closer to her feet and waited a little longer. 1 minute, then 2. The wind blew harder, carrying with it fine dust. Hannah felt her throat dry up, not necessarily from thirst, but from a growing emptiness in her chest. Finally, a middle-aged man approached. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a worn-out coat. His voice was neither rude nor friendly. "Are you Hannah Cole?" Hannah nodded immediately, so quickly that even she was startled. "Yes, I am William Whitaker. My wife asked me to come and greet you." Hannah blinked. "What about?" Charles William Whitaker didn't answer immediately. He simply gestured for Hannah to follow, his voice lowering slightly. "We'll talk about that later. It's not convenient here." The statement didn't sound like a secret, but it was enough for Hannah to understand that something wasn't right. The Whitaker house was on the edge of Dry Creek, a sturdy, unadorned log cabin. Mrs. Whitaker greeted Hannah at the door with a polite smile and a scrutinizing but not malicious gaze. She led Hannah inside, showing her a small back room where there was a narrow bed and a low wooden table. "Everything is temporary," she said, her voice soft but distant. "Just rest. You must be tired." Hannah thanked them and put her bag down. The room was clean but strange. Nothing in it belonged to her. And that's what made Hannah feel for the first time clearly that she was standing on a fragile line between hope and abandonment. Dinner was served in just the right amount of silence. The Whitaker family didn't ask many questions. Hannah didn't dare ask too many either. She ate slowly, listening to the familiar sounds of a family that wasn't her own, the clinking of dishes, the sliding of chairs, the ticking of the wall clock. Charles is not mentioned. After the meal, Hannah helped clean up as if it were a deeply ingrained reflex. Mrs. Whitaker thanked her without refusing. The kindness here took a clear form, enough not to hurt but enough to maintain distance. Night fell quickly in Dry Creek. The wind whistled through the cracks in the window. Hannah lay in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the strange sounds of an unfamiliar place. She thought about the train that had departed, about the miles of journey now behind her. She doesn't have a return ticket. The next morning, Hannah woke up early. Mrs. Whitaker had prepared breakfast. When Hannah asked gently, cautiously about Charles, she simply said that he was busy, that everything will become clear. It's not a lie. But it's not a guarantee either. Hannah began to understand that this absence was no small incident. It was the first sign of a reality she was unprepared to face. But she didn't cry. She didn't complain. She just felt a quiet unease, like standing in a wide field, not knowing when the wind would change direction. For the next few days, Hannah stayed at the Whitakers' house like a guest, with no intention of leaving. She did housework, read, and observed the town of Dry Creek from afar. The people there were polite but not friendly. They looked at her with curiosity, then quickly turned away. No one called her fiancé. No one knew what to call her. Hannah began to realize that in this frontier region, status wasn't something that was taken for granted. It had to be affirmed by action, by presence, or by time. And currently she had none of those. She wrote a short letter inquiring about Charles. No reproach, no demands. Just a very polite question. The letter was sent, and Hannah waited. Waiting was something she was used to. But this time the waiting carried a different weight. It wasn't just waiting for an answer. It was waiting to see if she was truly accepted here or merely tolerated out of politeness. Because when a woman has strayed too far from her starting point, the absence of the promised man is no longer a minor detail, but the first silent test of her courage. And as Hannah Cole waited for an answer that might never come, the fragmented stories of the town of Dry Creek began to piece together, revealing the first cracks in the narrative she once believed to be solid enough. Rumors don't come all at once. They arrived sporadically, uninvited, like a breeze through a crack in the door, at first just enough to rustle the curtains, but eventually becoming impossible to ignore. Lydia Warren first heard them in the Silver Flats grocery store. The shop owner didn't say it directly. It was just a casual remark while weighing flour for another customer. The northern mines have been so quiet lately. Strange. No one answered. But the atmosphere in the shop dropped a notch. Lydia stood at the back counter holding the shopping list. Mrs. Whitaker had asked her to fill out. She didn't ask. There was no need to ask. But that thought lingered in her mind longer than necessary. Silver Flats is a town that thrives on mining. Life is measured by the number of ore trucks, by the sound of dynamite blasts each morning. When those sounds become less frequent, people start to notice, even if they don't want to admit it. In the following days, Lydia noticed that Charles hadn't shown up. He didn't disappear completely. He still sent letters, but they came less frequently. They were shorter, and they were different. No more detailed explanations, no more specific questions, just polite delays. Work commitments don't allow it yet. Things are in a sensitive phase. We'll meet when the time is right. The right time, a phrase without a shape. Lydia read the letter in the small Whitaker's room, the oil lamp illuminating the familiar handwriting. It was still the same neat handwriting, still the same dignified tone. But she began to notice something that made her uneasy. Charles's letter was still proper, but no longer specific. And for Lydia, ambiguity was what was truly frightening. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't ask any questions. She had learned that in small towns like Silver Flats, questions often came faster than answers. Instead, she observed. She observed the men coming and going from the pub at an unfamiliar hour. She observed the conversations being interrupted as she approached. She observed how Mrs. Whitaker fell silent whenever Lydia mentioned Charles's name, neither avoiding the topic nor responding. One afternoon, Lydia helped clean up the town's makeshift library, just a few old bookshelves in the meeting building. An elderly woman came to borrow a book and sat down to chat. She talked about the weather, about the coming winter, then suddenly changed the subject as if by accident. "You know these mining investments lately. Not all of them are clean." Lydia nodded politely as if she didn't understand. But even after the woman left, the words echoed in the empty room. No one said Charles did anything wrong. No one accused him. But no one defended him either. The cracks began to appear in that way, not loudly, not clearly, but enough to shake the foundations of trust. Lydia began to ask herself questions she had never allowed herself to think about before. Why did Charles never come to the station to pick her up? Why were all their meetings postponed? Why did the letters no longer mention the future but only speak of waiting? She didn't rush to conclusions. She knew that doubt could destroy more than the truth. But she also understood that blind faith wasn't a virtue, especially for women who had staked their lives on a sensible decision. At night, Lydia lay listening to the wind blowing through Silver Flats. The town wasn't asleep. It was just silent, as if holding its breath. She thought about the first letters, clear, certain, full of factual detail, and she wondered, had people changed, or was she simply seeing a previously obscured side of herself? She didn't feel betrayed. Not yet. She just felt lost. One morning, Lydia decided to walk through the northern mine. Not inside, just from a distance. She saw the mine gate was closed. No vehicles coming or going. No noise. A few men stood huddled together, speaking softly in hushed tones. No one paid any attention to her. And that's what sent a chill down Lydia's spine. Because in places where people are constantly watching each other, collective silence always has a reason. She returned to the Whitaker house, her heart heavy. Mrs. Whitaker asked if she was tired. Lydia nodded. Mrs. Whitaker asked no further questions. Kindness now took the form of avoidance, not cruel but no longer selfless. Lydia wrote another letter to Charles. This time she was more direct. No accusations, just very specific questions. When she closed the letter, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear of the answer but from fear of no answer at all. And in that moment, Lydia Warren understood that when a story begins to show cracks, the most frightening thing is not the truth behind it, but the fact that people have believed it for too long to easily turn back. Because some beliefs don't collapse with a single fall, but with a series of small signs, enough for a level-headed person to begin to doubt, but not enough for a courageous person to confront them. And while Lydia Warren awaited a letter that could explain everything, Silver Flats prepared to face an event no one could conceal, a truth that would no longer allow anyone to believe without paying a price. The morning in Copper Ridge began like any other, with the sound of wind blowing across the hillside and the lingering smell of coal smoke in the air. Eliza Moore was rearranging books in her small reading room when the ground shook ever so slightly, like a sigh held back for too long. Then came a second sound, louder, deeper, echoing from the north of town. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. Mine. The alarm sounded later than usual. When it did, the sound was drawn out and hoarse, as if the alarm itself were weary. Eliza stood still, her hands resting on the wooden table. She didn't run. She had learned that in moments like these, running wouldn't help one understand what was about to happen. People began pouring into the streets. Men abandoned their work, women stood on their porches covering their mouths. In the distance, a thick, heavy column of black dust rose, not dissipating like ordinary smoke. It stood there like a period hanging suspended in the sky. The news came late, but details weren't necessary to understand the scale of the problem. A massive mine collapse. Many people trapped. Not enough escape routes. Not enough time. Eliza followed the crowd toward the mine, stopping at a safe distance. She looked at the familiar faces, the men who used to greet her every morning, borrow her books, talk about the coming winter. Now they stood there motionless, waiting for news no one wanted to hear. By afternoon, the truth began to emerge in fragmented pieces. It wasn't a sudden accident. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was the removal of support pillars. It was the compromise on safety procedures to meet deadlines. It was the decisions signed in a closed room miles away from the mine. The name Thomas Caldwell was mentioned at first very softly, then more clearly. Thomas Caldwell, the man who wrote dignified letters to Eliza. The man who spoke of stability, responsibility, and a future built through hard work. The man Eliza trusted not with impulsive emotion, but with the confidence of a mature person. That evening the police arrived. There was no struggle. No need. Thomas Caldwell was led away, his face pale, his eyes vacant. He didn't look at the crowd, nor did he look for Eliza among them. Everything unfolded smoothly, like a prearranged procedure. Eliza stepped back. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't ask why. She felt a chill spreading through her, not from the wind, but from a realization that had just become clear. The man she was about to spend her life with was not only a failure, but had chosen an immoral path. It wasn't because he was poor. It wasn't because he was incompetent. It was because he put profit above the lives of others. That night, Copper Ridge was sleepless. Crying echoed from the small houses. The lights remained on. Eliza returned to her room, sat down on her bed, and rested her hands on her knees. She thought about every word in the old letters, precise, orderly, and concise. She realized something she hadn't seen before. Handwriting can be perfectly proper, but morality cannot be faked forever. The next morning, the official news was posted on the town's bulletin board. The list of the dead was longer than Eliza had prepared herself to read. She didn't look for familiar names, she already knew them. She just stood there reading it all as a way of respecting those who had no chance to speak. Some people looked at Eliza with awkwardness, not reproach, not pity, just the community's embarrassment at someone suddenly losing their former status without having a new one. She was no longer the future fiancé, but she wasn't an outsider either. Eliza understood that from this moment on there was no turning back. No matter how Thomas explains it, no matter what the court rules, she cannot continue to tie her life to a choice that has trampled on human dignity. She gathered the letters, not tearing them up, not burning them. She tied them together and placed them at the bottom of the trunk, not to keep them, but to close the chapter. There are things that need to be put away in their proper place so that people can move on without denying the past. Eliza Moore didn't leave Copper Ridge immediately. She stayed helping bereaved families, cooking, reading letters to the illiterate. Small things, but real. And it was during those days that she felt most acutely what she had lost and what she must never lose: dignity. Because there are truths that, once revealed, leave no room for turning back, only the opportunity to stand tall even if alone. And as Copper Ridge gradually settled after days of mourning, Eliza Moore entered a new state, no longer a woman waiting, but a woman without status, forced to learn to stand on her own merits. After days of mourning, Rock Hollow returned to its old rhythm of life faster than Martha Ellison had anticipated. Shops reopened. Pubs were filled with laughter. Men went back to work as if the town needed the busyness to distract from what had happened. Only a few houses with black curtains couldn't hide their loss. Martha was still there, but in a different way. She was no longer introduced as the future fiancée, nor was she called by any other name. In Rock Hollow, when a woman loses her status before she has a chance to gain it, the community often chooses to remain silent. Not malicious, just avoidance, an old habit of small places. Martha had no husband, no money, no social standing to be invited to the conversations she used to have at the same table. She became the woman nobody talks about. In the early days, it felt as heavy as a wet shirt. Walking down the main street, Martha felt glances pass by and then turn away. No one asked how long she would be staying. No one asked what she needed. The politeness in Rock Hollow had very clear boundaries, enough not to hurt but not enough to reach out and pull someone off the edge. Martha rented a small room behind the old tailor shop. The owner, an elderly taciturn widow, handed her the key and left. No advice, no questioning. Martha thanked her, put down her bag, and opened the window to let in the light. The room was empty but clean, and most importantly, it was hers. She started making a living by doing small things. In the mornings, Martha helped people write letters sent to the east reporting good news or asking for more money. At noon, she cleaned the makeshift reading room at the meeting house. In the evenings, she cooked for bereaved families, not because anyone asked her to, but because a hot meal was the only thing she could give without explanation. No one paid her, and no one stopped her. Martha understood that in Rock Hollow, status no longer protected her, but work could. She didn't do those things for recognition. She did them because if she stopped, she would start hearing unanswered questions. There were days when she was so tired she didn't want to get out of bed. But then she thought of the people who had lost their lives because of others' wrong choices. She thought of the fact that she was still standing here with her hands, with the ability to do the right thing, and so she got up. Gradually, the town's perception changed, not with praise but with familiarity. People began nodding when they saw her. They began reserving a seat for her at the long table during community meetings. No one mentioned her past. And Martha didn't need them to, for her honor wasn't something to be given away. It was something to be preserved by refusing to compromise on what she knew was wrong. One afternoon, as Martha was rearranging her books, a child asked her, "Are you staying here long?" Martha paused, thought for a moment, and replied, "As long as I need to." That answer wasn't a promise, but it was the truth. Rock Hollow didn't become kinder just because Martha was resilient, but it learned to accept her presence, a woman without a title but with tangible value. And for Martha, that was enough for now. Because there are stages in life when people don't need to be named, they just need to live authentically and let time speak for itself. And it was during those days when no one mentioned her name that Martha Ellison began doing something small, not to change Rock Hollow, but to keep the people of this town a place to remember, learn, and hope. It all started very small. There was no opening ceremony, no speeches, not even a sign. It was just an empty room behind the town hall of Dustmere where Helen Porter had asked permission to place some old wooden shelves and stack books that no one used anymore. Some were donated, some she had brought from the east. Some were old textbooks, their spines worn, the print faded but still legible. Helen didn't call it a library. She simply called it a place for books to stay. Dustmere is a small town hastily formed around the railroad and coal mines. People come here to work, not to read. But Helen understood that even in the harshest places, people still need a corner to sit down, breathe, and remember that they exist, not just to work. Initially, nobody noticed. Helen opened the door to that room every afternoon after finishing her chores in town. She dusted it, arranged the books, and straightened the crooked wooden table. Some days no one came by. She would still sit there reading or taking notes, or simply watching the sunlight stream through the small window. Then one afternoon, a child stood in the doorway. The boy didn't come in. He just watched. Helen looked up, smiled, and didn't wave. After a moment, he came in, picking up an old picture book. The next day, he returned, bringing his younger sister with him. The children arrived first. They brought no preconceived notions. They simply needed a quiet place and someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Helen read to them, her voice even slow, and without excessive expression. She didn't lecture. She just read. Then there are the elderly. A retired miner, his legs aching, could no longer do heavy work. He came, sat quietly, and read old newspapers. He didn't speak, but he came every day. A widow asked to borrow a cookbook, not to learn new dishes, but to reminisce about the old days. Gradually, the small room developed its own rhythm of life. Quiet, not crowded, but regular. People began saying to each other, "If you need to find Helen, just go to the library behind the meeting room." No one mentioned her past anymore. No one called her a disgraced woman. No whispering. No pity. In Dustmere, she gradually became known by a different name, unofficial but very real. The library woman. Helen first heard that name from a young man. She didn't correct him, nor did she acknowledge it. But that evening, as she locked the door of her small room, she lingered a little longer, her hand resting on the wooden latch. She was no longer invisible, not because someone else took credit for it, but because her presence had become necessary in the simplest way. Helen worked tirelessly, but without rushing. She categorized the books in her own way, not according to a complex system, but according to the reader's needs. Children's books were low and easy to reach. Books for the elderly were near the window. Technical books were placed near the long table for the workers to study at in the evenings. No one asked her to do it. She did it because she understood. On some evenings after work, the laborers would stop by, their hands still smelling of coal, their eyes weary. They didn't read much. They just flipped through a few pages, asked Helen a few questions. She answered briefly, without showing off her knowledge. She knew that what they needed wasn't wisdom, but a feeling of being respected. Dustmere didn't become richer because of that little library, but it became more peaceful. And Helen, a woman who had once been without status, began to rediscover something she had long lost, the meaning of waking up each morning and knowing she would do something useful for others. She doesn't call it healing. She just calls it living on. One late afternoon, as the last rays of sunlight streamed through the window, Helen sat alone in her study. The familiar scent of old paper, wood, and dust filled the air. She reflected on her journey, the losses, the irreversible choices, and for the first time in a long time she felt no bitterness. I only felt peace. Because there are people who don't need to be saved, they just need to be placed in the right place where their quiet value can shine through without needing any introduction. And it was from that quiet stillness, when Helen Porter was no longer searching for anything for herself, that another quiet gaze began to emerge in Dustmere from a man more accustomed to observing than speaking. Jonah Reed isn't someone who's usually seen in the town center. His sheep farm was about an hour's ride from Dustmere, where the pastures stretched endlessly and the wind blew incessantly. Jonah was used to working alone, more familiar with the sound of sheep bells than with the sound of people. When he went into town, it was usually only to buy salt repair tools or deliver wool. He finished his work and left, never lingering. Therefore, few people noticed Jonah Reed starting to appear near the small library at the back of the meeting house. Initially, he simply stood at a safe distance. He didn't step inside. He didn't stare. He just stood there, his hand on the brim of his hat, like someone waiting for an unnamed task to be completed. Helen Porter didn't realize it right away. She was used to people walking by, glancing at her, and then moving on. But Jonah was different. He didn't look curious. He looked like someone assessing something that needed to be thoroughly understood before making a decision. Jonah Reed didn't know much about Helen. He only knew that she was the one who had built that library. Not with money, not with power, but with her consistent presence every day at the same hour, working in the same way. He saw her arranging books. He saw her reading to children. He saw her listening to tired men talking about work without interrupting. Jonah showed no pity. He had seen enough people in his life who needed pity. People who had lost their land. People who had lost their families. People who were no longer able to stand. Helen Porter did not belong to that group. She stood tall. Her shoulders did not slump. Her eyes did not waver. And that, with Jonah, is worth noting. One afternoon, when the wind was blowing stronger than usual, Jonah entered the library for the first time. No lengthy greetings. Just a nod. Helen looked up and returned the nod. He didn't ask her who she was. She didn't ask him what he needed. Jonah picked up an old book on animal husbandry, flipped through a few pages, and then put it back. He asked a short question. "Do you have any books about the northern steppes?" Helen pointed to the shelf on the left. No further explanation. Jonah took a book, sat down at the table, and read slowly. When he finished, he put the book back, said thank you, and left. Nothing in that meeting suggested any romantic feelings. But for people accustomed to practicality, respect is shown through not disturbing each other. In the days that followed, Jonah returned. Irregularly, not on schedule, but each time he came, he observed how Helen worked not to find fault but to understand the rhythm of her life. He realized she wasn't trying to impress him. She didn't talk about her past. She didn't explain why she was there. And Jonah didn't ask. On the farm, Jonah Reed was accustomed to judging people by what they did, not by what they said. He looked at Helen's hands, lightly calloused from labor, not soft or weak. He looked at how she arranged the space, practical, functional, unpretentious. One afternoon, Jonah stayed longer. When the room was empty, he asked, "Do you need any more bookshelves?" Helen looked at him, slightly surprised. "Yes. But I haven't found the right wood yet." Jonah nodded. "I do. No promises. No agreements. Just information being shared, like how people talk about the weather." A few days later, the wood arrived. Enough for the job. Already sawn. Jonah didn't go into the study that day. He left the wood by the door and went. Helen gazed at the pile of wood for a long time. She saw no ostentatious generosity in it, only timeliness, something she valued more than any words of comfort. From then on, Jonah occasionally helped repair shelves, build tables, and bring old chairs from the meeting house. He did it in silence. Helen did the same. They worked side by side without needing to say much. The townspeople began to notice. No one spoke loudly. Just brief glances, knowing nods. But no one named what was happening. And it was this unnamed quality that preserved everything pure, unhurried. Jonah Reed made no promises. He didn't talk about the future. He didn't talk about feelings. He didn't talk about what this meant. But then he appeared, and stayed long enough for Helen to realize that there are relationships that begin with consistent presence that don't need immediate definition. Is this love? That question doesn't need an answer yet. Not now. Because for people who have experienced loss, love, if it exists, must begin with respect and small actions, not with big words. And as Jonah Reed began to appear as a familiar part of the quiet afternoons in Dustmere, the Montana winter was also quietly approaching, bringing with it challenges that wouldn't allow anyone to live solely on kindness. The wind started changing direction very early in the morning. Those who have lived in windfall long enough recognize it before the snow falls, not visually but in their bones and joints, in the way the horses become more irritable each morning in the gray skies that linger longer than usual. Montana winter doesn't come with a roar. It arrives as a decision made long ago. Matthew Cole knows that better than anyone. His farm was on the edge of windfall, where the wind lashed against the wooden fence and offered no shelter but barren grassy hills. Matthew didn't speak much, but when he did talk about winter, his voice left no room for argument. "Winter waits for no one," he said to Clara Hayes one afternoon before the first snow had fallen. "And it doesn't care whether you're a good person or a bad person." Clara stood in the small library, still rearranging the children's books. She understood Matthew's meaning but remained silent. She was used to listening before responding. "This room," Matthew continued, his gaze sweeping across the bookshelves, "will not keep you warm. This is not a threat. It's just a truth being spoken at the right time." Clara had lived through tough times, but the Montana winter was something else entirely. It wasn't about loneliness or temporary hardship. It was a test of preparation. Kindness, however valuable, couldn't replace firewood, food, or a sheltered roof. Matthew didn't object to Clara helping the town. He just didn't believe that her help alone could sustain her through the winter. "You need a livelihood," he said as they stood on the porch, the wind gently rustling Clara's dress. "Not a promise, not goodwill, something concrete." Clara didn't argue. She simply asked a short question in her own way. "What do you propose?" Matthew looked at her for the first time, not avoiding her gaze. "I need someone to manage the books and the payroll. Not a wife, not a benefactor. A job." That statement stood between them, stark and realistic. Not romantic, not sentimental, but it carried weight. Clara thought about the library, about the children who came to read every afternoon, about the old people sitting silently by the window. She knew that if winter came and she didn't have a stable source of income, everything she had built would vanish, not out of malice, but because of the uncompromising cold. The wind grew stronger. A heavy gray cloud rolled over the hilltop. Clara suddenly understood that the faintest hope wasn't in others but in time itself. "It won't. Matthew didn't press the matter. He simply added one more sentence as if nailing down what he had already said. I'm not saving anyone. I'm just preparing. Clara returned to the library that afternoon with a heavy heart. She lit the fireplace, but the fire was weak. She looked at the bookshelves, the things that had given her a sense of belonging, and realized for the first time that belonging did not equate to survival. In the days that followed, Windfall began to stockpile. People bought salt, flour, and reinforced windows. Conversations shifted to the same topic: this year's snow might come early. Clara stood in the middle of town listening to those remarks and understood that winter was a challenge that didn't allow for sentimentality. She didn't give up on kindness, but she began to question, was her kindness putting others and herself at risk? Matthew returned, carrying the ledgers and the vault key. No further explanation, no repetition of the offer. He simply placed them on the table as if stating a fact. Clara looked at the numbers. It wasn't difficult. She'd worked with order her whole life. The hard part was accepting that to continue doing good, she had to accept a realistic structure, discipline, accountability, and just enough constraint. She signed her name in the register, without a trembling hand, without hesitation. That evening, the first snowfall occurred, light but persistent. Matthew stood on the farmhouse porch watching the snow gradually cover the ground. Clara stood beside him wearing a thick coat. No one spoke. It wasn't necessary. They all knew that winter waits for no one, and hope is only valuable when accompanied by preparation. Because in the frontier, compassion alone is not enough to keep people alive, but when placed within the framework of responsibility, it has a chance of lasting. And it was when Clara Hayes accepted that proposal, which wasn't a declaration of love, that she stepped into the threshold of a new relationship, one where respect takes precedence over promises. Caleb North didn't say that right away. He had Sarah Whitman sit down first on the wooden bench by the fireplace to warm her after the windy journey from Alder Run to Northfield. He poured tea, placed the cup before her, then sat opposite her, his hands resting on his knees. The fire burned steadily, not flared up. Winter had truly arrived outside, and the log cabin needed frugality to survive the cold months. She knows this farm well, Caleb said in a low voice. She knows the rhythm of the work. She knows how to keep records, how to distribute food. Sarah nodded. She was used to opening lines like that, frank, direct, no beating around the bush. At Alder Run, people talked a lot. At Northfield, Caleb talked just enough. But I want to make it clear, he continued, looking straight ahead. My proposal is not marriage. The words fell like a heavy object, but without causing a shock. They lay there, clear, unmasked. Sarah wasn't startled. She simply felt a void being cleared, a place where assumptions usually resided. I need a butler, Caleb said. Clear salary, private office, authority within the scope of work. No obligations, no title. Sarah gazed at the fire. She thought about the other offers that had come her way, vague promises, pitying glances, assumptions that a woman traveling alone needed to be rescued. At Northfield, there were no such glances, only a job placed on the table. And if you don't want to, Caleb added, I'll still pay you for the days you worked. No debt, no promises, no pressure. Just respect expressed through structure, not emotion. Sarah took a sip of tea. She set the cup, still thinking slowly. Since arriving in Montana, she had learned that lasting decisions rarely come from impulse. They come from clarity. How much is the salary, she asked. Caleb answered with a number. Not too high, not too low. Enough to live on. Enough to save up. Enough for a person to stand tall without bowing their head. What are your working hours? Sarah asked again. Caleb explained it clearly. There are long days. There are short days. There are peak seasons. There are off seasons. Everything is set within a predictable framework, something Sarah had lost for too long. And Sarah paused for a moment, then continued, I kept my name. Caleb nodded. Of course. That moment wasn't romantic. But it was right, and for Sarah, right was more important than beautiful. She accepted the offer the following morning. Not with a formal handshake, just a neat signature in a notebook, a room key handed over, and a schedule placed on her desk. Northfield remained unchanged by that decision, but Sarah did. She moved into the east room, the window overlooking the sheep pen. Every morning she set the kitchen, checked the inventory, and recorded the accounts. Every afternoon she reviewed the list of tasks for the next day. Caleb worked in the fields. When they needed to communicate, they spoke briefly. When they didn't, they remained silent. No one asked, "What are you two to each other?" And it is this very lack of questioning that keeps everything standing. At Alder Run, some were curious. Some speculated. Sarah didn't explain. She was past the age where she needed to explain her life to people who weren't responsible for it. Caleb didn't argue either. He knew honor didn't need a loud voice. On some evenings when work was finished early, they would sit on the porch. Not too close together. Not too far apart. The fire in the hearth burned steadily. The wind blew through the fence. They talked about the sheep season, about the railway line that was about to open, about the price of salt. The topics weren't dreamy, but they were shared. Sarah realized this after a few weeks at Northfield. She wasn't defined. She was given responsibility and with it authority. When she suggested changing how food rations were allocated, Caleb listened. When she decided to hire more people during peak season, he signed off. No one saved anyone. No one owes anyone anything. Only two people put respect first. One snowy afternoon, Sarah brought the ledgers out onto the porch for Caleb to sign. After signing, he pushed the ledger back in. His finger paused briefly on the edge of the paper without touching her hand. "Thank you," he said. Sarah nodded. "Me too. That statement doesn't have a double meaning. But it's enough. If something is blossoming, it doesn't need to be named yet. In the borderlands, the most resilient things often grow in silence, nurtured by doing the right thing each day. Because for those who have experienced loss, loyalty, if it exists, must begin with principled kindness, not cheap romanticism." And as Sarah Whitman found herself firmly in that new role, without title, without promises, she understood that before her lay the threshold of a different life where choices were no longer driven by fear but by self-determination. Mornings in Pine Crossing arrive slowly, as if the sun needs more time to decide whether or not to cross the horizon. Anne Whitlock stands on the front steps of her house, her hand resting on the worn wooden door frame. A thin mist clings to the grass. A gentle breeze blows just enough to stir the kitchen curtain behind her. There is no calling, no clock urging. Just a moment of stillness, very real, when life asks itself whether it wants to stay or move forward. Anne had lived in Pine Crossing long enough to understand its rhythm. In the mornings, people greeted each other with a nod. At noon, the sound of horse-drawn carriages rolled through the main street. In the evenings, oil lamps lit up and each house retreated into its own space. Here she had a name. A job. Familiar faces who knew what she did each day and trusted her. Safe, it's a quiet word. It's warm just right and easy to stay in. But on the outskirts of town, the dirt road stretching west where Anne had learned to work with her hands and mind was still there. The road offered no promise. It only opened up possibilities. And possibilities for Anne were both alluring and frightening. She remembered those early days on the frontier when everything was new, when every decision came with a price. She learned to stand tall without seeking recognition. She learned to take responsibility without demanding promises. She learned to maintain kindness within the confines of reality. Those lessons weren't loud, but they stayed. Anne went back inside, poured some water, and put the kettle on the stove. These familiar actions calmed her. On the table, an open notebook lay at the bottom, neat handwriting recording work expenses and plans for the coming season. She didn't write down big dreams. Only things she could achieve. Outside, Pine Crossing woke up. Footsteps. Doors opening. People calling out to each other from the end of the street. Here, she could continue doing what she did well, helping those in need, holding a place she didn't have to compete for. But that other path, though it doesn't name her, still exists. Anne remembered a saying she once heard. Some doors don't close with a sound, but with the fact that we stop looking in their direction. She wondered if she had stopped looking. She stepped out onto the porch again. The light was brighter. The mist was dissipating. The wet grass glistened. At a suitable distance, someone in the house across the street had opened a window, a small sign of an ordinary morning. Ordinary, and therefore precious. Anne wasn't in a hurry. She understood that lasting decisions didn't need to be made in a single morning. But there were also moments that, if not listened to, would pass and never return. She thought about what she wanted to hold on to: independence. Not loneliness. Not isolation. Independence, meaning choosing to stay or leave without being driven by fear or debt. Choosing because she was strong enough to stand on her own 2 feet. At Pine Crossing, she's safe. Out there, she's independent. Those two things aren't contradictory. They just require her to answer a different question. Anne stepped down the steps. Her shoes touched the wet ground. She paused, looking at the road not as a challenge but as a possibility waiting to be called. She didn't know whether she would stay or leave today. And for the first time in years, that uncertainty didn't frighten her. Because whatever she chose, she knew she wasn't going back to square one. She had come far enough to understand her own worth, and long enough to not need to prove it with a hasty decision. Anne smiled, not at the future but at the present, where she stood, with her feet firmly planted, with the choice in her hands. Because some stories don't end with answers but with the reassurance that good people have learned to choose their own path. And if Anne Whitlock were to leave or stay, it would need no explanation, for the way she lived would be the answer itself. Clara Whitfield's story doesn't tell us everyone will be loved eventually. It says something far deeper and more practical. A person's value doesn't lie in how quickly they are chosen, but in whether they dare to maintain their dignity when they are not chosen. Clara didn't win because of her beauty. She didn't win because of her words. She won because she didn't let rejection define her worth. In modern life, many of us, especially those who are quiet and hardworking, have felt not enough, not good enough to be recognized, not interesting enough to be noticed, not loud enough to be listened to. But this story reminds us that quiet acts of kindness are never meaningless. Honest work always finds its place, sooner or later. And lasting love doesn't begin with promises but with respect. The man from the frontier didn't save Clara. He only saw her as a capable, responsible, and dignified human being, and sometimes being seen for who she truly is a great healing experience. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story to the end. If you find a part of yourself in Clara Whitfield, please like the video, share it with those who need comfort, and subscribe to the channel to continue accompanying us through the humane, slow-paced, and hopeful stories of frontier hearts, because good people deserve to be remembered, and quiet hearts also need to be listened to.